So I'm continuing with the series we're doing this summer. If you've not attended, we're doing Bible stories you can't forget, no matter how hard you try. So it is with some trepidation and some self-questioning that I find myself preaching today on the Bible story called Sodom and Gomorrah. It's one of those stories most of us have heard about, yet likely very few of us have read ourselves. Has anybody read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? It's a story, and like I said last week, in many of the Old Testament that portray God in a way as violent and punishing a God who destroys the sinners and saves the faithful. And as I said last week, these old Bible stories are not intended as commentaries on or necessarily descriptions on the very nature of God, nor are they really trying to recount an actual historical event, but instead trying to express something far more profound: how the ancients experienced God and what they thought God expected of them. So it's not only the violence, but part of my trepidation this morning is the very scandalous nature of the story as I read it, filled with threats of sexual violence, unmitigated cruelty. This is not a children's story to be taught in Sunday school. It'd be the kind of story or book that would be banned from the public library, if you will. The children's section, especially of the public library. There's a reason why this story is likely not taught in Sunday school. It is admittedly an awful and horrific story. So you might ask, why the heck, Alex, are you preaching on this story this morning? I got to get ready for the World Cup, right? It's a good question. But a big part of my reason, and I must confess this, a big part of my reason, the first part of my reason, in many ways why I thought of it, is how this story has been used through the ages, even today, as a condemnation of homosexuality. It is one of those gotcha passages. It is often the story many so-called preachers or social media Christians use in the culture wars to call homosexuality a sin to be punished by God. In fact, if you think about it, the very laws we have in our country that were passed censoring and outlawing homosexuality were called sodomy laws, getting its name from our story this morning. So I think it's important that we truly read and truly understand this story so as not to allow the biases of our culture, our history, our times misinterpret the Bible. And first I preach this morning because I want to state emphatically it's important to say out loud and clear that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not homosexuality. This story does not condemn people who are gay and lesbian or bisexual in their orientation, was not even understood to do that at the time it was told. It's not even really about sex, though the threat of rape as a form of power, as a form of domination is there. We need to be clear to those who would use this story, those who'd preach this story as an excuse to say God hates gays, condemns them to hell and destruction, and many churches preach that. I try to tell them to really read the story. Second, And I actually was wrestling with really rather to wrestle with this text. And there became a more subtle reason for preaching on this text about that question: what is if it's not homosexuality, what is the actual sin of Sodom and Gomorrah as told in the Bible? Really, what is being condemned here? And it occurred to me as I wrestled with this text that it has something to say powerfully to us these days. Now, by sin, I don't mean, sometimes we hear that word as meaning we're breaking the rules, but sin is understood in the Bible as an actual brokenness and disconnection and alienation from God and those around us. And despite its use, this story, in bashing gays and lesbians throughout history, this story, I really believe, has something profound to say to all of us this morning. Something very important about who God calls us to be, about what God calls us to overcome, about how we repair disconnection. And I was struck by that these days, right? So I'm going to have Kim put up the text, and I will warn you, if you haven't read this story, it is challenging. The 19th chapter, the book of Genesis. The two angels come to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house, spend the night and wash your feet, then you can rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But Lot urged them strongly, so that they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But even before they laid down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." And Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, came near the door to break it down, but the men inside reached out their hands, brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Son-in-laws, sons, daughters, anyone you have in the city, bring them out of this place, for we are about to destroy this place. Because the outcry against his people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is essentially and simply inhospitality, outright threats and hostility towards the stranger and outsider. That is the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think this not because it's something in my own head or my own biases, my own interpretation of the story, but because the rest of the Bible, when it references the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, claims that is its sin. The prophet Ezekiel describes the sin of Sodom was pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. The prophet Isaiah uses Sodom and Gomorrah as a symbol of rampant injustice, lack of care for the poor and outsiders. Jesus himself refers to the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah when describing the towns that were not welcoming to his disciples. The story itself conveys that message. Lot sits at the gateway of Sodom and sees the two strangers, leaps up to welcome them, inviting them into his home where he will feed them and protect them, urging them, as it says, strongly to join him so he could wash their feet and give them a feast. He is a model of welcome and hospitality. And that is contrasted with what happens next. But even before they were able to lay down and go to sleep, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, no women, surrounded the house, shouted and threatened for Lot to hand over the strangers and outsiders. I do not think the description of all the men is a description of sexual orientation, but maybe of the ways in which men act in the world. So when Lot refuses, there is an interesting exchange in which the angry, the very cruel crowd banging on his doors. He goes out and closes the door behind him, demanding Lot hand them over. And he stands between him and the guests. And the mob is trying to get at them. And he's saying, they are under my protection. And the crowd becomes even more incensed, even denigrates Lot, claiming he himself, if you notice this, Lot himself is an alien. The Hebrew word here is ger, meaning a foreigner who lives in a place without full citizenship, who lives without inherited land rights, a refugee, a stranger who was not native to their city. That's what they hate. Lot is ger himself. So could it not be more clear that the brokenness at the heart of Sodom and Gomorrah is this inhospitality, this cruelty towards the stranger and towards the outsider? And as I wrestled with the text this week, with that message very hard to come to, I could not help but see, this week especially, the parallels, right? The arrests of so-called illegal aliens, ger, incarceration in prison encampments, seemingly random killing of people because they might be illegal because the color of their skin is different, brown or black, and because they may speak a foreign language. The sheer intimidation, power exercised by men, banging on doors of homes and cars. It just hits you between the eyes. I think we are more comfortable with the interpretation of the story as being a condemnation of homosexuality because it excuses us from having to come to terms with our own brokenness in caring for the foreigner and stranger in our midst. So I'm left with a question. An important question for me: where is the grace in this story? Is it simply about destruction and condemnation by God for those who have a cruel hate of the stranger? Is it a warning to us? Is it a threat? The grace I found in this story is twofold. The grace of Lot, who stands at the gate, looking, searching, paying attention to, and looking for the strangers that he leaps up to welcome and brings into his home. It isn't just that he came across them at the local Casey's, or it isn't just that he happened to bump into them, that he was actively seeking and searching for the stranger, seeking out someone to invite into their home. And Lot literally puts his body, his life, everything he loves, in a shocking way, if you read that story, everything that is valuable to him, to protect the foreigner. To put his life, his family's life, everything between that hateful crowd and these two strangers. And the image I carried with me this week was the people of Minneapolis, right? The second aspect of grace for me is this profound truth: that the strangers we meet, the foreigners we invite in our homes, could be angels, messengers of God. We welcome, we invite, we embrace, because in that act we see God. It's not something we just simply do, but it is a profound way we experience God in the world. We exhibit, we experience grace in inviting the stranger, the foreigner, the gare, the alien into our lives. Who here has ever heard of a town in France called Les Chambon? This is a town in south central France that in the years between 1940 and 1945 hid and protected and shielded 3,500 Jewish refugees from the Nazi forces, from the Vichy government, at the risk of their own lives. In fact, their pastor got arrested, imprisoned, many of them actively resisting what was happening as they tried to smuggle Jewish people to places where they would be safe. And some of that reality and a number of scholars asked, well, how is it this one community was such a small town and community led by a church? Why was it that they were able to resist and do these things at the risk of their own lives? And as the story is told about this community, it wasn't something that everybody jumped out at first. It took a long time to talk and reflect. And scholars found certain lessons from La Chambon. One is, we can develop communities of resistance. We can be communities that resist authoritarianism and the harm that's done to people. And sometimes it's only in community we find that strength. The second lesson Was that shared values need to be named. You can't be quiet. You have to talk to each other and talk to those around you about what we hold is value. And the third lesson is don't look away. Look for. Much like Lot stood at the gate of Sodom, he didn't look away, but he looked for. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.